The dark reports before him stated, "We clear an area, leave, and the terrorists return the next day. The villagers don't trust us because we don't stay. We need a new plan." General Kabore, the aging head of the armed forces, had responded with the traditional solution: "We need more equipment, more air support. The French have offered additional helping teams." "No," Traore cut in firmly. "More foreign helpers aren't the answer. We've had French, American, and European training missions for years, and the situation has only gotten worse. We need Burkinabe solutions for Burkinabe problems." The room had fallen silent, the tension clear. Since taking power, Traore had always pushed against relying on Western military support, arguing that it often came with hidden plans and failed to address local facts. It was Colonel Mayam Sankura, one of the few women in the high command, who broke the silence with an unexpected proposal. "Mr. President, I've been reviewing our information on rebel methods. They've changed specifically to our male-dominated force structure. They know our patterns, our limits." She paused, gathering courage for her next words. "But they have a weakness we haven't used. Their religious extreme beliefs make them deeply uncomfortable fighting with women in combat. They believe being killed by a woman prevents their path to paradise." The room filled with rejecting whispers, but Traore leaned forward, interested. "Continue, Colonel. I propose we create a special all-female unit trained specifically for the unique challenges of our northern regions. Women who understand the language, the culture, who can gather information no male soldier could access, who can build relationships with female villagers who have been constantly scared into silence." General Kabore laughed. "With respect, Colonel, this isn't some gender equality experiment. We're fighting a war against tough extremists." "Exactly," Sankara countered, undeterred. "And we're fighting it exactly as they expect us to. What if we did something they could never expect? Something their beliefs haven't prepared them for?" Traore studied the maps on the wall, considering the proposal. It was radical, unusual, and precisely the kind of new thinking he had been demanding from his military leadership. "How would this unit operate differently from our current forces?" he asked. Colonel Sankara was prepared for this question. They would be trained not just in combat operations but in community making stable. They would deploy to a village and stay, establishing security while at the same time building relationships, particularly with the women and children who see everything but are never consulted by male soldiers. They would serve as both warriors and bridges between the military and civilian populations. The debate had continued for hours, with traditional military leaders raising objections about women's physical abilities, cultural feelings, and supply challenges. Traore had made his decision by the meeting's end. "We will establish this unit," he announced. "Colonel Sankara, you will oversee its formation. Select 50 women from our existing forces, plus another 50 civilian recruits with relevant skills, languages, medical training, community development. You have 3 months to create a working unit." As the meeting ended, General Kabore approached Traore privately. "Mr. President, with respect, the Western helpers will strongly oppose this. They have established rules and teaching. Then we won't inform them until the unit is working," Traore replied simply. "This is an independent Burkina program. We will seek forgiveness rather than permission." The selection process began immediately and proved more challenging than expected, not for lack of candidates, but because of a huge response. When the call went out for women to join this special unit, over 2,000 applied within the first week. They came from every region of Burkina Faso, existing military workers seeking new challenges, police officers, nurses, teachers, and many who had personally suffered from extremist violence. The training compound outside Ouagadougou became a testing place for new ideas. Traditional special forces training was changed to focus on the unit's unique mission. Beyond combat skills, the women studied local languages, cultural feelings, basic medical care, and community development plans. They trained a lot in the specific urban and rural environments they would operate in, using mock villages to practice clearing operations that reduced civilian deaths. Captain Aisha Ouedraogo emerged as the natural choice to lead the unit's first working company. Raised in a border village that had later fallen to extremists, she spoke 4 local languages and had served with honor in the regular army. More importantly, she understood the dual nature of their mission. "We need to be both fearsome fighters and community builders," she told her troops during training. "Our male equals focus on the enemy. We must focus equally on the civilians. Victory isn't just removing rebels from a village for a day, it's making that village strong against their return." 3 months into training, word of the experimental unit reached Western military helpers in the capital. The reaction was as expected negative. A French colonel assigned to the EU training mission demanded a meeting with Traore. "Mr. President, this program weakens years of setup teaching. These women cannot possibly be ready for combat operations against tough rebels with only 6 months of training." Traore had listened politely before responding, "Colonel, your country has been providing military assistance in the Sahel for over a decade. In that time, the rebellion has grown stronger, not weaker. Perhaps it's time to try approaches your teaching hasn't considered." Despite foreign doubt, training continued. The women developed new methods that they played to their strengths rather than trying to mirror male units. They focused on information gathering, exact operations, and community work with. They trained a lot in pairs and small teams, developing an almost natural working together. 6 months after that initial meeting, the unit was deemed combat ready. Their first deployment would be to the Somme province, one of the most fought-over regions in the country. The mission: reclaim and hold the village of Cumbri, establishing a model for a new approach to fighting rebels. Now, as Captain Ouedraogo led her troops through the village, they faced their first real test. The rebels had fled before their arrival. An information leak had unfortunately warned them of the operation, but the challenge of securing the village remained. Sergeant Fatima Dio, leading Bravo team through house-to-house searches, encountered the first major challenge. In a small compound at the village edge, the women were barred from entering by an elderly man. "No women with weapons will enter my home," he declared firmly. "It is against our traditions." Rather than force entry as male soldiers might have done, Sergeant Dio approached differently. Addressing the respected elder in his local language, she said, "We understand your concerns, but the women of your household have suffered under those who occupied this village. Perhaps they should decide if they wish our protection." From inside the compound, female voices began to speak. After a brief but intense family discussion, the compound gate opened. The women inside, who had endured weeks of harassment and fear under rebel occupation, welcomed the female soldiers with cautious relief. This scene repeated throughout Cumbri. While some traditional male leaders initially resisted the female military presence, the women of the village embraced it immediately. For the first time, they had security forces they could speak to about the specific threats they faced: sexual violence, forced marriage, and restriction of movement. By nightfall, the Lionesses had secured the village and established their base of operations. Unlike previous military missions, they didn't withdraw to a distant outpost at sunset. They stayed, maintaining security through the vulnerable night hours when rebels typically returned. Captain Ouedraogo established her command post in the village center, making it clear to the population that they were there to stay. That evening, she held the first community meeting, inviting both male and female villagers to express their needs and concerns. "We are not just here to fight," she told the gathered crowd. "We are here to help you rebuild, to ensure that when the rebels are gone, they have no reason to return." The women of Cumbri, initially hesitant, began to speak. They described how the rebels had identified sympathizers among the population, how they had stored weapons, and where they had established observation posts. Information that male soldiers had spent months trying unsuccessfully to gather. Over the next weeks, the Lionesses implemented their unique approach. Half the unit maintained security operations, conducting patrols and establishing checkpoints. The other half focused on community making stable, reopening the village school, establishing a basic health clinic, and creating secure spaces for commerce to resume. Particularly new was their Shadow Sister program, where each female soldier was paired with a local woman. These partnerships created a web of trusted relationships throughout the village, generating real-time information that allowed the unit to prevent rebel infiltration attempts. When the first attack came 3 weeks into their deployment, the rebels were unprepared for what they faced. Expecting the standard male military unit that would hunker down in defensive positions, they instead encountered an integrated defense that involved both the Lionesses and village residents who had been trained in basic security rules. The fight was brief but decisive. The Lionesses' superior information had allowed them to prepare ambush positions along likely attack routes. When 30 rebels approached at dawn, they were met with precisely targeted fire from unexpected positions. 8 were killed, 3 captured, and the remainder fled. The psychological impact was profound. Intercepted communications revealed the rebels' confusion and dismay at being defeated by female fighters. Their belief system that being killed by a woman would deny them paradise created hesitation and fear during fights. News of the successful defense spread rapidly through both military and civilian channels. President Traore, who had staked significant political capital on the experimental unit, visited Cumbria 1 month into the deployment. He found a transformed village, markets reopened, children in school, and most significantly, a population actively partnered with the security forces rather than passively enduring their presence. In a secure briefing with Captain Ouedraogo, Traore received her candid assessment. "The model works, Mr. President, but it requires resources and patience. We're not just clearing rebels, we're addressing the conditions that make communities vulnerable to them in the first place." Traore nodded thoughtfully. "The Western helpers are demanding data, metrics of success." Ouedraogo smiled slightly. "Tell them to come see for themselves. Our metrics are reopened schools, functioning markets, and villagers who warn us of threats rather than hiding them." Following the success at Cumbria, Traore made a bold decision. Rather than treating the Lionesses as a limited experiment, he authorized the expansion of the program with 4 additional companies to be trained and deployed to other fought-over regions. The announcement triggered immediate international reaction. Western military partners expressed concern about deviation from established fighting rebels' teaching. Human rights organizations worried about the risks to the female soldiers were significant. Religious conservatives within Burkina Faso objected to women in combat roles. Traore addressed these criticisms directly in a national broadcast. "For too long we have fought this rebellion using foreign teachings, foreign equipment, and foreign thinking. The result has been continued suffering for our people. The Lionesses of the Sahel represent a truly Burkina solution, drawing on the strength, intelligence, and courage of our women to protect our communities in ways no outside force can." He continued, addressing the broader significance: "This is not merely a military program. It is a declaration that in Burkina Faso, women are not just victims to be protected or bystanders to be ignored. They are essential partners in securing our nation's future." 6 months into the program, the results were undeniable. The 5 villages held by Lioness companies had remained secure, with rebel activity dramatically reduced. More significantly, these communities had begun to revitalize, economic activity resumed, displaced residents returned, and local governance structures re-established themselves. The approach wasn't without challenges. The units faced supply difficulties, occasional resistance from traditional leaders, and the constant threat of changes by rebel forces. Several Lionesses had been killed in combat operations, their sacrifices marked by national mourning and strengthened resolve among their comrades. Yet the strategic impact extended beyond military metrics. In villages across northern Burkina Faso, young women began to see new possibilities for their roles in society. Applications to join the Lionesses far exceeded available positions. Community women's groups formed to support the units, creating civilian networks that further isolated rebels from potential safe havens. Perhaps most telling was the response from neighboring countries facing similar rebellions. Mali, Niger, and Chad sent military observers to study the Burkina model. Within a year, all three had begun establishing their own versions of female-led security units changed to their specific contexts. But inspired by the Lionesses' success, the French military establishment, initially dismissive, grudgingly acknowledged the program's effectiveness. A confidential assessment that leaked to African media concluded, the all-female units have demonstrated unexpected tactical advantages in the specific cultural context of the Sahel conflict. Their integrated security-making stable approach warrants further study. For President Traore, the Lionesses represented something beyond military new ideas. They embodied his core philosophy that African nations needed to develop solutions based on their own facts rather than imported models. In a region where women had long been pushed aside from security discussions, despite bearing the brunt of conflict's impact, their emergence as security leaders represented a profound social transformation. Years after their formation, the Lionesses of the Sahel had expanded to over 1,000 members, operating across Burkina Faso's northern regions. Their distinctive approach had become a cornerstone of the country's national security plan, complementing rather than replacing conventional forces. Captain Ouedraogo, now promoted to major, reflected on their journey during a training session for new recruits. When we began, people asked if women could really fight. That was never the right question. The question was whether we could secure our communities in ways traditional forces had failed to. The answer is in the villages where markets are open, where girls attend school without fear, and where families sleep soundly through the night. She surveyed the faces of the new recruits before her, former teachers, students, farmers, and shopkeepers, all now preparing to join the ranks of the Lionesses. Our strength isn't in the weapons we carry, though we use them when necessary. Our strength is in understanding that true security comes not just from defeating an enemy, but from building communities strong against their return. In his presidential office, Ibrahim Traore kept a simple photograph on his desk. It showed a Lioness soldier helping a young girl carry books into a reopened school in a formerly fought-over village. For him, it captured the essence of what they were fighting for, not just the absence of violence, but the presence of hope and possibility. The Lionesses of the Sahel had proven that security could be reimagined, that women could lead that reimagining, and that solutions to Africa's most difficult challenges might already exist within its communities, waiting for the courage to try something new. As rebel groups continued to change their methods, the Lionesses changed in turn. Their approach remained dynamic, evolving based on lessons learned from each deployment. But their core philosophy remained constant. That sustainable security required the full participation of women, not just as beneficiaries but as leaders and implementers in villages across northern Burkina Faso. The arrival of the Lionesses' distinctive vehicles no longer brought surprise. Instead, it brought something that had been absent for too long, confidence that this time the security forces weren't just passing through. They were there to stay, to listen, and to build a peace that could endure. 3 years after the formation of the Lionesses, President Traore hosted an international security conference in Ouagadougou that brought together military leaders, security experts, and government officials from across the continent. The centerpiece of the conference was a field demonstration by the now veteran Lioness units, showcasing their unique approach to integrated security. As foreign observers watched, the Lionesses demonstrated not just combat abilities but their comprehensive security model. They performed scenarios showing village protection, information gathering through female networks, and the important civil-military operations had become their hallmark. What you're witnessing isn't just a military unit, Traore told the assembled delegates. It's a complete reimagining of what security means in communities that have experienced generational conflict. These women don't just secure territory, they transform it. The French military contingent, once the most vocal critics of the program, now sent their own female officers to learn from the Lionesses. A French colonel, after observing a demonstration of the Shadow Sister program, admitted to Major Ouedraogo, "We've been fighting in the Sahel for a decade with sophisticated equipment and satellite information. Yet your women, with basic gear, have achieved more sustainable results through human connections." Ouedraogo's response was diplomatic but pointed: technology can win battles, but only human relationships can win peace. The Lionesses' impact extended beyond security metrics into broader social transformation. In a region where women had traditionally been excluded from public roles, female village leaders began to emerge in communities where the Lionesses operated. Girls' school attendance reached unprecedented levels as families saw new possibilities for their daughters' futures. Fatoumata Dio, once a quiet seamstress from a small village near the Mali border, had joined the Lionesses after rebels killed her husband. Now a senior sergeant commanding her own squad, she reflected on this transformation during an interview with Pan-African media. Before joining the Lionesses, I believed my life was over when I lost my husband. Now I understand it was just beginning. I've helped liberate 12 villages, protected hundreds of families, and trained 36 women in my shadow sister network who continue the work when we move to new areas. She paused, her expression softening slightly. Last month, a father from Jibwa village brought his daughter to meet me. She was maybe 7 years old. He told her, "This is what you can become." That moment meant more to me than any military decoration. The program was not without continuing challenges. The physical demands of continuous operations took their toll. The psychological burden of serving as both warriors and community builders created unique stresses. The Lionesses experienced casualties, each one mourned deeply, both within the unit and by the communities they protected. Recognizing these challenges, Traore's government established specialized support systems, a dedicated medical unit focused on women's health issues in field conditions. Rotation schedules ensured no team remained in high-intensity deployment for too long. Psychological support services were integrated directly into the command structure rather than treated as an afterthought. As the Lionesses' fourth year of operations began, the strategic landscape of the region showed measurable changes. Rebel groups, once able to move freely across northern Burkina Faso, found their territories increasingly constrained. Information networks established by the Lionesses' Shadowister program made it nearly impossible for fighters to blend into local populations. More significantly, recruitment for extremist groups declined sharply in areas where the Lionesses operated. Young men who might once have joined rebels out of economic desperation or belief manipulation now had alternatives: community defense forces, agricultural cooperatives, and other development programs established alongside security operations. The Western security paradigm, which had separated military operations from development work, treating them as sequential rather than simultaneous, was fundamentally challenged by the Lionesses' integrated approach. International development agencies began studying the model, recognizing that security and development were not separate phases but interconnected processes. At a strategic assessment meeting with his Security Council, Traore reviewed the program's evolution. "What have we learned that can be applied to other challenges facing our nation?" he asked his helpers. Defense Minister Sankara, who had first proposed the female units, responded thoughtfully. "The key lesson is that our solutions must emerge from our own understanding of our challenges." The Lionesses succeeded not because they adopted foreign teaching, but because they created approaches specific to our cultural and working environment and the role of women. Traore pressed that excluding half our population from security solutions means we fight with one arm tied behind our back. Sankara replied firmly, "The Lionesses have proven that inclusion isn't just a moral principle, it's a strategic advantage." This philosophy began to extend beyond military applications. Traore's government launched programs to integrate women into other sectors previously dominated by men: governance, resource management, and judicial reform. Each time, the success of the Lionesses provided a powerful example that challenging traditional gender restrictions could yield results that benefited entire communities. International recognition followed. Major Ouedraogo was invited to address the United Nations Security Council, the first African female combat commander to do so. Standing before the world's most powerful security body, she delivered a message that challenged conventional wisdom: security is not something that can be imported or imposed. It must grow from within communities themselves. And women, traditionally portrayed only as victims in conflict, are actually essential architects of lasting peace. Her words resonated far beyond the formal chambers of international diplomacy. In conflict zones from Colombia to Myanmar, women's organizations cited the Lionesses model as evidence that female participation in security was not merely symbolic but strategically essential. 5 years after their formation, the Lionesses of the Sahel had evolved from an experimental unit to a core component of Burkina Faso's national security. Their approach had been refined, codified, and expanded. More than 2,000 women now served across multiple specialized units, each changed to specific regional and working contexts. The original Lionesses, including Captain Ouedraogo, now Colonel, had become national heroes, their images appearing on murals in schools and public buildings. But perhaps their greatest legacy was invisible, the generation of young girls growing up in villages across Burkina Faso who now imagine different futures for themselves. For President Traore, the success of the Lionesses vindicated his core philosophy, that African nations needed to find African solutions, that new ideas often meant challenging established dogma, and that true security came not from sophisticated weapons but from the full participation of communities in their own protection. At a graduation ceremony for the newest class of Lioness recruits, Traore addressed the women who would soon deploy to continuing conflict zones. You join a unit that has changed not just how we fight, but why we fight. Your purpose is not merely to defeat an enemy but to create conditions where enmity itself becomes unsustainable. You protect not just territory but possibility, the possibility of a Burkina Faso where all citizens, regardless of gender, region, or background, can contribute to our shared future. As the new recruits took their oath of service, the original Lionesses stood at attention nearby, their faces reflecting pride in what they had built. They had begun as an experiment that most experts predicted would fail. They had become instead a model that many were now trying to emulate. In the northern village of Cumbri, where the Lionesses had first proven their approach, a small monument now stood in the central square. It depicted not a weapon or a battle scene but a simple image, a female soldier and a village woman standing side by side, their hands joined. The inscription read simply, "Security is built together." This philosophy, that lasting security required the full participation of all community members, that women were essential security actors rather than passive recipients of protection, and that military and civilian approaches must be integrated rather than sequential, had transformed not just Burkina Faso's fighting rebels' plan but the very concept of what security meant. As conflicts continued to evolve across the Sahel, the Lionesses evolved with them, changing methods and approaches to new challenges. But their core identity remained constant. They were not just warriors, though they fought when necessary. They were builders of a new kind of peace, one that grew from within communities themselves rather than being imposed from outside. For Ibrahim Traore, the Lionesses represented the embodiment of his vision for Burkina Faso's development, solutions that drew on local knowledge and resources, that challenged harmful traditions while respecting cultural identity, and that recognized every citizen as a part of the solution. Potential contributor to national progress. The greatest weapon in our arsenal, he often reminded his helpers, is not any technology or tactical teaching. It is our willingness to imagine different possibilities and our courage to pursue them, even when others insist they cannot work. The Lionesses of the Sahel had begun as just such an imagined possibility. They had become a reality that changed not just military operations but social expectations. And in doing so, they had demonstrated that the answers to Africa's most persistent challenges might already exist within its communities, waiting only for the vision to recognize them and the courage to bring them to life. In secure command centers and distant diplomatic offices, foreign military experts continued to analyze and debate the Lioness phenomenon, seeking to distill technical lessons and replicable methods. But in the villages of northern Burkina Faso, where markets now bustled and children played freely in streets that had once been deserted by fear, the evaluation was simpler and more profound. Peace had returned, and this time it seemed it might endure.